Hi guys, so I've been gone for a long time. I do apologise. The last few months have been very busy with work and other stuff. So I do apologise for being gone. I am back now. Don't know how frequent it'll be, but I'll do my best to maintain a decent schedule. And today we're looking at the vocal ranking of GFriend. Let's go. Okay, so I went into this ranking kind of being told that GFriend were a bit of a vocal powerhouse group. And yeah, their songs are kind of written in an insane way where like all of the members at some point or another have had to showcase like insane mixed belts or things like above a B4, which like for a female voice is doable but often pretty difficult unless you're not technically pretty proficient. So yeah, all the way through, they've got good singers. Every single person has showcased some form of difficult vocal or technical vocal at some stage. So I'm really ranking this based on like an average of what I've heard and kind of performances where they're not just using a mic on stage and hearing a lot of different things to make sure that I understand the ranking of where people are in terms of their average ability. Because everyone's done crazy stuff, everyone sounded a little bit less good, but all the way through, they are really strong singers. And there's one person in particular that's absolutely insane, that I'm sure all of you already know, but if you don't, wait till we get to her. Anyway, all the way through GFriend are awesome. Let's delve into the vocals and get started with the vocal ranking. Let's go. Okay, so in a group this powerful vocally, someone's got to be the least able. Having said that, Sowon went through a pretty huge vocal improvement at one point, and she went from being like not the best to actually a pretty accomplished singer. Let's watch her sing and break it down. Okay, so I think a thing that's really important to mention is Sowon isn't the weakest singer necessarily because she has like the worst technique or she isn't the most able or she's just not the best or anything like that. She has the least varied voice, I would say, and the one that has showcased the least number of places to go into and has showcased the least difficult technical vocals. I mentioned at the start of the video, everyone's done like technically impressive stuff in this really high mixed key. Sowon's voice didn't really do that necessarily. Her voice did go up into higher areas from what it used to and what its kind of baseline is, but it's the one that's got the least technically amazing sound, I guess, all of the way through. Having said that, her voice is actually really nice, really pleasant, and as weak as singers go, she's pretty damn good. Okay, the vocal improvement I mentioned, the earliest clips I saw, her voice still sounded fundamentally similar. She was still using a pretty thin delivery. It was still pretty connected. She didn't really use too much air necessarily. There wasn't too much air in the sound to make it really brittle without any chord closure to get into a higher space. Just her voice, it was connected enough, but it was a nice thin, light delivery to get into slightly middle, higher places, more efficient than just a big, beefy voice would allow for. However, earlier on, she used to have pretty substantially noticeable tuning issues. She seemed to kind of fall off the pitch quite a lot. She went flat, a little bit of extra air would creep into the sound. That would make things a little bit harder to sustain in kind of a mixed belted configuration. She seemed to have a pretty difficult time staying in pitch and staying in key and doing things in that way. Then as she went on in her career, she seemed to get a lot more comfortable in this middle place of her voice. So while she doesn't have the insane mixed potential of everybody else, because her voice just simply doesn't get into a mixed place by bringing chord closure into a more forward head-based space to get into a nice mix, a nice forward pingy mix like most of the other people have showcased on occasion, her voice doesn't get super tight, it's not super nasally, it's just a thin, light delivery that doesn't really showcase much in the way of variety or kind of away from her lower, more spoken tone. When she's in the low notes and then in the low part of her voice, it sounds comfortable, it sounds easy, it sounds nice. And as I say, because it is connected, it's got a nice stability and fundamental of tuning there now, which it didn't used to have as such, which is why I think she's got a really good vocal improvement. But the only reason she's last is because she has the least varied technique, I'd say, the least spaces to go into, and her voice works really well in the lower end of it and kind of the middle part of her voice because it is thinner and lighter and she is getting to that space nice and efficiently. Just there isn't really much in the way of a kind of more forward placement to get it higher, or much in the way of a really robust, bigger sound kind of above this. So yeah, she's not a weak singer by any means. She's got a nice, pretty, pleasant voice that hasn't got a great deal to it, but I know she's the main rapper, or at least GFriend don't really rap much, but I know that's her role. So she's a perfectly substantially good kind of sub-vocal role. Okay, so a lot of people in female K-pop groups are regarded as having like a Disney princess voice if they kind of sing in a really thin, light sort of way. And Umji, yeah, that's a kind of apt description. Her voice is very Disney princess, but the way it's used is very interesting, so let's have a look at it and see what she does with her voice. Drinking from plastic cups, singing Alright, so when I say Disney princess voice, what do I mean? So, a lot of the time, stylized K-pop vocals can be very thin, very light, very quiet, with a lot of extra air in the sound, which is kind of exactly the same way that Umji uses her voice. Now, she doesn't use it necessarily as a crutch or a limiter. She clearly has a very naturally soft, delicate spoken tone. So when she uses that to sing, she's got a very naturally thin, light presence all the way through. Now, this would be an issue to a point if she had absolutely no chord closure whatsoever and couldn't do anything other than just, I can sing like this with extra air, which a lot of the time is what she kind of does, but she's showcased as she wants to add a little bit more chord closure occasionally, she can get into a slightly higher mixed space. Now her voice, what it does impressively sometimes is it does maintain that chord closure, use that naturally thin, lighter delivery that has a lot of air in the sound to thin it out and go into this higher, bigger belt. I haven't heard it a great deal, but there are occasional clips out there of Umji when she stays a bit more big, bit more connected, a little more chord closure in the sound to unleash pretty nice mixed notes. They're a little bit tight because if your natural coordination is thin and light, it doesn't take the chord closure necessarily super naturally, so it can sometimes sound like a bit's pulled and a little bit strained, but her voice generally worked okay in that area. But that isn't really what her voice is known for doing. I think that's why I've put her above Sowon, because she has that part of her voice that she has accessed on occasion, and it is pretty impressive to a point. But more often than not, Umji's voice is very much in this very thin Disney princess style, but because she does it like that with extra air in the sound, it's thinned out all the way through quite naturally. So as she kind of goes up, it goes up into the middle of her voice pretty well and pretty efficiently, and it sounds fairly nice, and the tone's very consistent. On all live performances I heard, her voice didn't really falter. There was no tuning issues, there was no super obvious placement issues. She just used that part of her voice in the middle of her voice really efficiently, really well to thin everything out and very nicely. So she had a very consistent, very good vocal delivery. The only issue she had is because she does have a naturally thinner, lighter, airy coordination, as she went up, outside of the isolated instance where she did mix into a pretty big, strong place, she more often not favoured the head voice approach. She most of the time kind of went, I'm singing a highway, and flipped immediately into like a falsetto kind of configuration, because her voice doesn't naturally take to having too much chord closure when all the time you sing with such a lack of chord closure and a thin delivery all the way through. So to me, Umji's voice is consistent, it's very solid, it works in a nice way all the way through because it is thinned out and is lightened with the extra air in the sound. It just isn't super varied because of that, and it doesn't have as easy a time getting into more variety of chord closure and power and other kind of vocals that everybody else coming up does. Their voices are more varied. Umji's voice is solid, it's nice, it's just not super varied, and the thin coordination lacks a bit of a mixed potential occasionally. Okay, so I'm famously kind of terrible at pronunciation of any name that's remotely tricky. I googled this and it said SinB. There's a H there, apparently. So if that's wrong, blame Google. I'm going with SinB. Okay, so the next two people are kind of interchangeable to a point. They're what will be kind of, I guess, described as lead vocalists if the lead vocalist is also a main vocalist, if that makes any sense. Anyway, these two guys are both really good, both really solid, and they have really good vocal deliveries. However, in my opinion, SinB of the two is marginally less varied. Okay, so SinB's voice is again one of those really interesting cases in GFriend of somebody who has like a natural affinity in a certain technique and coordination, but has showcased other stuff outside of that on isolated incidents. So there's occasional clips where she's like insanely good at like an F5 random scoop up, and you're like, okay, what the hell is SinB? That's not expected for a main dancer. Whereas more often than not, her voice is a little bit more pulled back, a little bit more restrained, and not quite that impressive all the time, but still solid all the way through. Okay, so for the most part, SinB's voice is naturally a bit thicker than the guys I mentioned so far. She has a natural chord closure, which is very good fundamentally for everything, because it means that you have a feeling of your chords together, which allows you to go up a bit and down a bit, as long as you can thin out using other things like vowels and airflow and breath support and all that wonderful stuff. That to me is where she falters a little bit. Her fundamentals are really good. So at the lower end of her voice and kind of the middle part of her voice, she has a really nice chord closure, a really nice full, naturally bigger sound. And as she moves up, she doesn't really necessarily maintain that feeling of chord closure all the way through, as everybody else, in my opinion, kind of does. So that limits her mix potential the most of everyone I've mentioned so far. As I said, I think in the lower parts of the voice and the middle part, it's really solid. It's got a naturally nasal placement as well, which thins things out a little bit. So as we kind of get into the middle of her voice, it's a nice, naturally easy sound for her to produce. And most of the time, the tuning's pretty solid. It does fall off now and again occasionally. I've heard it's not the most perfectly stable, tunable voice of all time, but for the most part, it's really nice and really good in this middle area. Because as she goes up, she generally favours a slightly thinner, more head-dominant mixed approach, which can be fine, but when you've got a natural chord closure, it's ideal to maintain that, thin out, and then unleash like bigger wah wah wah, kind of really big open notes like everybody else kind of does. Her voice, as it goes higher, tends to thin out like crazy into a kind of head voicey sort of sound, but it's still maintaining a little bit of pressure, so it sounds like a bit like a thin, light mixed belt kind of thing, and it's not the most efficient way of singing that higher key. So most of the time she generally stays in kind of a low to mid place, and a nice chord closure filled voice. Sounds good, sounds powerful, it's got a nice bit of resonance, it sounds open and easy. Because as she goes up, while she can do it on an isolated instance, has been like F5s where just maintain that chord closure, put it forward into her face and unleash things that are really powerful. More often than not, it does kind of get a lot thinner as it goes up, which in my opinion everyone else so far doesn't necessarily do, and kind of lose all resonance and power as she goes higher. So yeah, SinB's got a really nice, beautiful, pleasant singing voice, and it works all the way through, and the middle of it is very gorgeous. Because as it goes up, while technically occasionally pretty solid, it sometimes falls away a little bit, but mainly in comparison to everybody else. In other groups, she'd be like lead vocal material for sure. Okay, so to me, of everybody in this group, Yerin and SinB are the two that are the ones that are argued about kind of the most. They're both pretty similar in terms of technical ability. They're both really good, but to me, Yerin's voice has a little bit more to it and is slightly more efficient all the way through. But it is a bit of a toss-up, and if you have it the other way around, I understand. Let's watch this then. So Yerin's voice is bizarre. And by that I kind of mean online, a lot of comments said, Yerin almost has two singing voices, a cutesy one and a powerful one. And yeah, kinda. It's very interesting. So her natural kind of normal tone, for the most part, seems to be very kind of very cutesy, thin, wide voweled, thin, sort of naturally softer delivery, but it had core closure, it maintained a bit of pressure, so you could tell there was a bit of a depth and a bit of a power to it, and it sounded like the cutesy style was more style over substance a lot of the time, and kind of in the lower to mid parts of her voice, she maintained this kind of natural, thinner, lighter, whinier configuration, which, as I always say, thinned things out naturally, which made that whole kind of part of her voice easy to produce. Like, phonetically, it's not everyone's favourite, this whiny, cutesy sound, but in terms of technically, it made that whole part of her voice fairly simple, fairly easy, just like SinB's did. She had slightly more core closure, I would say, naturally, and Yerin used a bit of more of a wide vowel, thin, cutesy delivery. But they both kind of had the same kind of ability in this area, just the phonetic quality is obviously a subjective preference. As Yerin went up, however, her voice got a lot more powerful, a lot more resonance. It seemed like in the middle of her voice, she could flip away from this cutesy mode to a more like, kind of more full open, slightly more chest dominant, kind of thicker coordination. And while she didn't do this all the time, and there's only kind of some instance, generally while she's covering other people's high notes, she can definitely get some resonance and some power in this upper mixed area. While to me, SinB went slightly too thin on occasion and went up into the space, and it's like a kind of, it lost a bit of power and resonance. To me, Yerin's voice gains it in this area. Like, there was a clip once where it said, in a low note she sounded like Eunha, and then in a high note it sounded like Yuju, because obviously Yuju's got a famously powerful, thick belt. And Yerin does as well, to a point. It doesn't always have anywhere to go into above this naturally kind of chest-dominant mixed area. I don't always trust it when she's trying to thin it out even further into a higher mix. I don't think she's got that avenue necessarily down that well. But when she does like a certain scoop, and she kind of gets into a higher place and maintains that core closure, her voice has a lot to offer in that area. And while yes, it's not the most consistent ever, and she doesn't really do it all the time, I feel like it's an avenue her voice does have, nowhere near as often as the next two guys coming up, but way more often than everyone else I've mentioned so far. And I feel like because of that natural mixed place that she has, and naturally thinner, whinier middle place, which thins everything out and makes it really efficient, her voice all the way through is a pretty cohesive, pretty strong instrument. Just lacks a little bit of variety, I guess, in the upper extension, as the next two guys have, in my opinion, a little bit better. But she has quite a lot to her voice, quite a lot to offer, and it's pretty, it's pleasant, it's nice. It's just not as technically amazing as the next two guys coming up, but she's still a pretty solid singer. Okay, so in second place, as I'm sure a lot of you guys imagined, is the lead vocalist Eunha. Now, her voice is really interesting again. It's got a naturally thinner, lighter coordination that everyone in GFriend does, as well as something else going on as well. Let's watch her sing and I'll break it down. Right, so in seemingly like every K-pop group ever, they've got somebody who has a voice that's described as honey or angelic, which is essentially a buzzword for saying this person sings quite thin but does it fairly well. And now Eunha is kind of exactly the definition of what I mean, but as well as that, she has a little bit other stuff going on as well. So naturally, when she sings kind of in the lower end of her voice, in the middle of her voice, she sings with a very, very cutesy, thin delivery. It's very reminiscent to a point of Yerin's, but maybe a little bit thinner and a little bit more powerful than Umji's, but it's naturally very, I'm singing sweetly and softly, and she's kind of known for her softer, sweeter, honey, angelic vocals, but of everybody, she does this the most naturally. Her voice sounds the easiest, kind of doing this thin, lighter coordination and making the tune stay on, making the pitch stay consistent, making her voice sound nice and resonant in this area. She doesn't use too much of a fullness through most of her voice. She's just a nice, naturally lighter, thinner, slightly more airy delivery, which, as I always say, thins things out to get into the middle of the voice nice and efficiently and nice and easy. She does not struggle to get a little bit higher at all. Now, an issue a lot of people that have a naturally thinner coordination do have on occasion is when they go up past this place where thin and light works really well, this kind of middle of the fourth octave, their voice can get stuck, or they can naturally flip to a head voice like Umji does, or they can not have too many avenues to go into. Eunha does not have that problem at all. She has a natural chord closure that she seems to bring out kind of after the point where the thin light coordination stops working, which means she always has that chord closure to use, and the thinness is more of a style choice. As she goes up past this, she has a pretty resonant, powerful voice. Now, she doesn't have the upper extension of number one. Not many people do in K-pop I've heard so far. She can't like belt super efficiently really, really high, but in this kind of B4, C5, D5 kind of area, Eunha's voice has some power. It has some resonance. Her placement becomes a little bit more forward because it isn't actually thinner all the way through. It does sound a little bit tight on occasion. She gets there, it's nice and easy, and it still sounds thin and light and easy. But for example, on So Chang-wei's Tears, that a lot of people cover, she's doing really well for all of it, and then the really high, the sa kind of note, her voice starts to get a little bit tight because it's not used to necessarily having that much chord closure all the way through. So to me, Eunha's voice has a lot in the tank. It sounds beautiful and honey-like when it's kind of in its lows and middle of her voice, and it's eased out nice and efficiently and thinned out nice and efficiently. And then she has a chord closure to bring us this nice resonant forward open space that she does on occasion, like to use on occasion. But then when she kind of uses less resonance, it can sound a little bit tight and a little bit thin because of how naturally thin and soft her voice is. So yeah, it's got a belt, it's a decent belt. It's not as amazing as number one, not many people's is, but it's got a lot more in the tank than everyone else I've mentioned so far. It's more consistent than everyone else I've mentioned so far, and it's got kind of more variety than everyone else I've mentioned so far. She's a very good lead vocalist. It's more of a honey, cutie delivery with on occasion a bit of power and a bit of a rasp. Okay, so as my first ever Patreon video, I did a reaction to a compilation of Yuju's best vocals, and Jesus Christ! Jesus Christ! This woman is awesome, and I can't wait to talk about her. Just watch! Right, so a lot of you may be expecting me to kind of sit here and just talk about high notes, and am I going to? Absolutely. However, there's much more to Yuju's voice than just high notes that I think has been showcased really efficiently, even more recently, and back in the day, high notes are more her forte. So, correct me if I'm wrong, she seemingly went through at some stage a bit of a confidence in vocal delivery. I'm not sure necessarily why there was a confidence issue, but she seemed to kind of not do her high notes as safely and as confidently as she used to. But if that is the case, that allowed for her voice to actually mature and showcase some other things. So the thing I'll mention first is that in the lower end of her voice and kind of the middle of her voice, she has some beautiful vocal control. Her melody lines are beautiful. The different styles and variety of light and shade that she implements are beautiful. She can stay thinner, she can stay lighter, she can stay a bit fuller and have a more dark delivery down the lower end of her voice. She's got really nice low notes for somebody with a soprano upper belter range that she has access to. But when she's in the middle of her voice as well, she doesn't have to always be really heavy and have a lot of resonance. It can sound nice and easy, nice and thin. It can be a very soft sound. She has no issue doing multiple different coordinations, multiple different placements just to get that middle of her voice perfectly. And that's a sign of a really good singer. If you're not having to do something to get to a certain place, you are making choices to make it easy and amazing and wonderful. So yeah, Yuju's just bass voice all the way through is the best in GFriend. It's got the most variety, the most colours, the nicest sound in the lows, nicest sounds in the mids. But then she just goes, ha ha, how about my belt, huh? Right? And not many female idols I've heard so far, particularly not like the third generation necessarily, have the upper extension that Yuju does. So first of all, when I mentioned Eunha can kind of get to the B4, C5 area and sound a little bit thin and a little bit squeezed, Yuju could do that and just go, ha ha, how does open and full and big sound? And she just does that super mega efficiently. She takes a lot of chord closure from down low, puts a lot of the placement forward and in her head to make sure it's nice and thinned out and flexible, but sounds so big, resonant and powerful. And she opens her mouth really wide to give herself a lot of vertical space, which opens up a lot of place for the actual vocal cords to do things with. So yeah, when she opens her mouth, puts the placement forward and keeps the chord closure down low, her C5s are massive. And then, on top of that, she has like big E5s and like F5s to a point. People when they sing E5s and F5s in the female voice have to thin out like crazy and it can almost sound really mixy and head voicey almost, a lot of people do. No, Yuju sound like they're in a chest belt. They're obviously not, because you have to mix really efficiently and again, thin the placement out even further. She will be singing a lot of chord closure, but then she'll be bringing the placement more up here somewhere, really from the face and really forward to make it that easy to sing, that connected and that sustained in that high key. But she's doing like E5s, like they're B4s. They're so resonant, so powerful, so hard, and she can, wow, her voice honestly in that upper area, particularly early on in the career, and not so much at the moment, but she can still always do it. She has an insanely powerful, amazing mixed voice, and in GFriend, to me, everyone's good and great, and in the middle of their voice, they can do a lot of things. Yuju's middle is awesome, and Yuju's upper extension is absolutely godly and beautiful and amazing. And when I reacted to that compilation for the first time, I kind of went, alright, I've been waiting for somebody to do a sustained G5 belt or whatever it was. And yeah, Yuju's voice in that upper extension is really, really quite good. And it's not thinned out to the point where it lacks any sort of resonance. It still sounds huge and powerful. Of course, there are isolated instances where it sounds a little bit thinner and a little bit more nasally. Obviously, it might be a confidence thing. It doesn't sound quite as powerful or quite as good. But for the most part, her voice is huge, it's big, and it sounds fantastic. And her belt range is one of the better belt ranges, particularly in the upper mixed extension that I've heard in K-pop. So thank you for recommending GFriend. Yuju is awesome. Okay guys, that was quite a long entry for Yuju, I do apologise, I had quite a lot to say on her. Thank you so much for watching this episode, thank you for being so patient with me. I know I've took a long time, it's been hard to get the motivation for these videos for a little while, I've been doing a lot of other things. But thank you so much for sticking by me, and hopefully you'll continue to stick by me. For the next few videos, we will still be doing the girl group relay before moving on to soloists, but there is something I promised you guys a long time ago. If I ever hit 10k subscribers, which I've done somehow, thank you so much guys, a random dude online talking about K-pop vocals, how the hell did I manage to get to 10k? I have no idea. I promise you guys a NCT original 21 vocal ranking. Now that's going to be a huge undertaking. I've got a really good friend of mine going to help me out with the order, and we're going to talk about that together. So we'll try and get that out as soon as we can. I don't know when it's going to be, obviously I'm busy with work still. But I'll do my best to get you a really, really, really good, really long, really well thought out NCT Original 21 vocal ranking. That'll be the next episode, guys. Thank you so much for watching and being patient once again, and goodbye.